Hi, you've clicked onto today's tropical tidbit for Sunday. Not a whole lot to talk about in the tropical Atlantic this morning. This area of low pressure over the Bay of Campeche is moving westward and inland over Mexico. Here's Bonnie generating some rainfall over Louisiana. There's a big tropical wave here in the Western Caribbean interacting with an upper low. It has a couple of mid-level centers along its axis over here, and this area will be moving west-northwest and should not be significant threat for development, just some heavy rainfall for Central America and the Western Caribbean islands. We'll have to worry about a couple of fronts coming down here off the southeast coast and near Bermuda, one on Tuesday and Wednesday, and another one possibly later on this weekend. And we'll have to watch for possible homegrown mischief with weak low pressure developing along those fronts. Not a significant threat right now, but something to watch for. We've got a strong tropical wave coming off Africa with good rotation in an area of low pressure, and this will be coming west-southwest and curving westward later on in time here over the next week. And this will have to be watched. It'll be a fairly dry wave like Bonnie was as she came across, but this will have to be watched when it gets farther west towards the Caribbean and see if it starts to fire up some convection. And there is nothing going on in this area of the Atlantic right now, and this is because we do have the MJO in a place that is starting to be favorable for some more downward motion in the Atlantic, but this should not last very long. And if you remember, the GFS just yesterday had, like, someone spilled a red and pink paint bomb on this area in the Western Atlantic, and it just had this really big intense area of downward motion all the way through the first week of August. You can see that has disappeared on this morning's run. You can see that as soon as the downward motion gets into the Atlantic, it starts weakening, and you start seeing these greens pop back up into the Atlantic, and by the time we get to the second week of August, you can see them starting to intensify and come farther west. And this is exactly what I think is going to happen as the MJO starts to run back to where it belongs. You can see that the current phase has it all starting to take a little bit of a hesitant dip over here, and it's not going to want to run right through octant 3 and come all the way around like it's supposed to. It's not going to be doing that this year. You can see that this morning's run with the GFS is already starting to panic and try to take it back over here. It still takes it where it was trying to take it, but it's not as far up here as it was, and it's showing this little blip over here, and I think you'll see this evolve over the next few days as the model tries to catch on. The UK Met has already been all over this, taking it right back into the Atlantic where it wants to go over the next couple of weeks. You can see that over the last 90 days, the MJO has not even touched octants 4 through 8 at all, and none of the part of the world except for octants 1 and 2, which favor upward motion of the Atlantic basin, and that's all. This has been hanging out all in here and hasn't really gone anywhere else over the last 3 months. This is since late April, and this is the only place it has really been. And why is it hanging out in our backyard? Because we have the most energy to offer it. Remember, the Madden-Julian oscillation is an oscillation of upward motion, and thus it is going to tend to hang around where upward motion is naturally already elevated. And you can see that if we look at the worldwide tropics, the La Nina has cooled the Pacific, so there's a lot of sinking air in here. And the only places where upward motion is favored is where the water is warmest, and the water is warmest over here in the Atlantic. Very warm record sea surface temperatures for our tropical Atlantic, and you can see that they're also warm in the Indian Ocean, but the Indian tropical season is shut down until October or November, because when the monsoon comes up here, the summer heats the continent over here, which lowers the surface pressures, which is why the monsoon marches northward during the spring, and the focus of heat means that the upper ridge ends up over the continent, and you get these screaming easterlies across the tropical waters of the North Indian Ocean. You can see that there's greater than 50 knots of shear across this entire area, so their tropical season shuts down until the fall. So if the Pacific is shut down because of the La Nina and the Indian Ocean is done until the fall, where are you going to go for the focusing of heat and upward motion and the resulting tropical cyclones that will provide a way to release the heat that was built up in the atmosphere from the El Nino this past winter? Well, it seems like the Atlantic would be the natural choice over here. Is there a way we can tell if it's been doing that? And yes, there is. If we look at the sea level pressures, remember, if there's upward motion, there's lower pressures at the surface if the air is rising, and you can see that since July all these pressures have been very much low over the tropical Atlantic. These purples over here are all greater than 1.5 millibars below normal, and we've already had storms follow the axis of lowest pressures. Remember, you had Alex come into Mexico, you had Bonnie come all the way across into Louisiana, and you had TD2 Tropical Depression 2 come over here, all moving west and following the axis of lowest pressures in here. And if we look at the pressures for the last 30 days globally, you've got the high pressures over the Pacific, and you can see that the Atlantic is the clear winner over here. There are no pressures as low as this found in the rest of the world in terms of relative to normal. Very low pressures in the Atlantic. This is the place to go. Okay, this is the place to go. You get the high pressures in the Pacific because of the sinking air and the cold water. It focuses air right into the Atlantic. That's what we've been seeing, an anomalous monsoonal circulation over this part of the Atlantic. And if you want a bursting of tropical activity, it's going to be here, and we can't really avoid that because we had so much heat pumped from a strong El Nino. We went from a strong El Nino to a strong La Nina very fast, and that took the floor out of the atmospheric pattern. You're left with a ton of anomalous heat over this part of the Atlantic, which is why we're seeing record air and water temperatures in the Caribbean and other places, and that heat has to be released and taken care of somewhere. The Earth's heat balance and heat budget has to be balanced, and you can't do that without tropical cyclones. Remember, hurricanes are the Earth's most efficient way of taking heat from the equatorial regions up to the poles, and if you're going to go to some basin in the northern hemisphere this year for bursting in tropical activity, it's going to be the Atlantic, and we can see that clearly. The other thing is that the Arctic temperatures, which are above normal all winter because of the El Nino, and we saw the declining ice, you notice that they're coming below normal here and are now very well below normal, almost to freezing in the middle of the summer, and they're usually up here, and it's hard to get such large variation. And when the Arctic temperature comes cold, it means that there's a greater imbalance of heat between the equatorial regions and the poles. Even though we have a La Nina coming on, we still have an abnormal amount of heat in a great area of the equatorial regions that has to be balanced out, and this heat has to be released. The global temperature is still above normal, and when the Arctic temperature starts dipping down like this, that just increases the need for a balance. So you can see that it's going to be really hard to avoid a tropical bursting of activity. It's not going to just be a non-year and a bust tropically worldwide. You can't have that. So we're watching very carefully and concerned about this year for the Atlantic. This is why I'm still forecasting 18 named storms. I see no reason to change that. I think everyone should be very concerned about this season. You can see that the axis of lowest pressures is already setting up to direct storms west right into the Caribbean and the United States. Dangerous, dangerous pattern. You do not want to let your guard down on this year. You have to be ready for this. It's going to really unload come August. We could easily have had 4 named storms by now if Invest 92 outlet here had been named, and if Tropical Depression 2 had been named, we would have had 4 named storms, and 2 is already ahead of schedule. So we're not in the middle of a dud here. We're not busting. This is a dangerous pattern, and I hope everyone's ready for it this year is all I can say. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.